Hey everyone. So lots of you have been asking us to take a deep dive into large language models and specifically how they're going to impact healthcare.
Yeah, seems like LLMs are just everywhere these days.
They really are, but healthcare, that's different, right? The stakes are higher.
Oh, absolutely.
The data is way more complex, and the ethical considerations, well, those are huge. So we've gone through a ton of research,
17 papers.
17 cutting-edge research papers to try to figure out what's really going on here. Are LLMs about to completely revolutionize how we diagnose and treat diseases? Or is this all hype?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. So why don't we just dive right in? For anyone listening who might not be super familiar with this whole world, can you just give us a quick overview of what LLMs actually are and how people are thinking about using them in healthcare?
Sure. So basically, LLMs are these really sophisticated AI systems that are trained on enormous amounts of text data. And what they can do is understand and generate human-like text, which, opens up a whole bunch of possibilities in healthcare.
Yeah.
You can imagine like doctors using LLMs to help them diagnose difficult cases or figure out the best personalized treatment plan for a patient.
Okay.
Even just to streamline like all that administrative work that they have to deal with.
So potentially a huge help to doctors. But healthcare is so complex. I mean, I'm guessing there are some serious challenges here too.
Oh, for sure. One paper that really gets into this is a review by Garcia and his colleagues. They were focused specifically on LLMs in biomedical sciences.
Okay.
And, they highlight both the promise and the potential problems.
Okay. So like what kind of problems?
So one of the things that comes up a lot is what researchers call hallucinations. Basically, this means the LLM will sometimes just like generate information that's straight up wrong.
Okay.
Obviously a big concern when you're dealing with people's health.
That's a big one. Yeah. Well, let's say we can get those hallucinations under control. I mean, where are we actually seeing LLMs being applied in healthcare today? Like what's actually happening out there?
So we're seeing some interesting stuff in diagnosis and treatment, even for like rare diseases where figuring out what's going on can be really tough.
Okay.
There are researchers like Kamboj, Banerjee, and Gupta, and they've developed this algorithm called STORM, and it's designed to help figure out which data, like think blood tests, imaging scans, genetic information, which of those are the most important to look at when you're trying to diagnose someone with a rare condition.
So it's kind of like STORM is like a guide,
Exactly.
helping doctors focus on the clues that actually matter.
Exactly. And when you might not have a ton of data to work with, like with rare diseases, that kind of guidance can be really, really helpful.
That makes sense. I mean, it sounds like STORM could really speed up diagnosis, right? Make sure people get the right treatment faster.
Yeah, that's the hope. There was another really interesting study looking at how LLMs actually do on Polish medical licensing exams.
Okay.
Grzybowski and his team, they found that one of the models, GPT-4o, did incredibly well.
Like it passed.
Almost like a human.
Wow. So is it ready to like start seeing patients then?
Well, hold on. Passing a written exam is one thing, but dealing with the complexity of real-world medicine, that's a whole other challenge.
Okay.
There are still issues with things like, cross-lingual understanding and domain-specific knowledge that need to be worked out.
So still some work to do before we let the LLMs take over the clinic.
Okay.
What about research that's looking more at those real-world challenges of using LLMs in healthcare?
Right. Well, there's one group, Liu Wang Ma and their colleagues, they created this whole data set called MedChain, and it's designed to test how LLMs do in actual clinical scenarios.
Okay.
And what's different about MedChain is that it focuses on three key things.
Okay.
Personalization, interactivity, and sequentiality.
Okay. Break those down for me. What do those actually mean when we're talking about LLMs?
Sure. So personalization means the LLM has to consider each patient's, unique characteristics, medical history, just like a human doctor would.
Okay.
Interactivity means it has to be able to have a back and forth, ask clarifying questions, respond to new info.
Okay.
And sequentiality, that means it needs to understand how a clinical encounter actually flows from, diagnosis to treatment planning to follow-up care.
So it's like they're really trying to make this as close to real life as possible.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They also built an AI system called MedChain Agent that's specifically designed to work with this data set.
Okay.
And it's able to learn from past cases and even incorporate feedback. It's pretty cool.
So it's like the MedChain agent is getting on the job training, just like a human doctor would.
Pretty much. And their research shows that MedChain Agent performs way better than other approaches when it comes to those really complex clinical tasks. But one thing we have to remember is that privacy is a huge deal when you're talking about sensitive medical data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We can't get so caught up in the potential of this stuff that we forget about the ethical side of things, right?
Exactly. And researchers are really aware of this. Zhu, Yin, Liu, and Tian, they did a whole review of different techniques that are being developed to protect privacy in medical image analysis.
What kind of techniques are we talking about here?
Well, there are a bunch, like encryption, federated learning, and differential privacy. Each one has its own pros and cons.
Right.
But they're all aimed at keeping patient data safe while still letting researchers use it for, good.
Okay. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach to this whole privacy challenge. Are there any specific examples of how these techniques are actually being used in this LLM research?
Yeah. So one promising example is from Kwa, Dai, Yu, and their team. They've developed this compact LLM framework. It's meant to be deployed locally, meaning it can run right inside a healthcare facility.
Okay.
No need to send sensitive data to the cloud.
Oh, that's interesting. That sounds like that would definitely minimize the risk of data breaches and things like that.
Exactly.
But wouldn't smaller locally deployed LLMs be less powerful?
Well, that's the thing. These researchers, they're pre-processing the clinical notes using techniques that extract and highlight the most important info, kind of like creating like a condensed version for the LLM.
So it's like giving the LLM a cheat sheet.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And their research suggests that this can actually improve the accuracy of these smaller LLMs, making them a real option when privacy and resources are limited.
This is all so fascinating. It feels like we've only just started to scratch the surface here.
We definitely have.
There's so much more to uncover.
Absolutely. Welcome back. So before we move on, I just wanted to touch again on those smaller, locally deployed LLMs.
Yeah, that was something that really stuck with me from the first part of our deep dive. I mean, it seems like a really smart approach, especially when you think about just how sensitive all this healthcare data is.
Exactly. And it's not just about, privacy. Smaller models can really help level the playing field for places that don't have all that computing power, to run those massive LLMs.
Right.
It could make these technologies way more accessible.
That's a really good point. It's so easy to get focused on the cutting edge and forget about making sure that these advances actually reach, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we were talking about how LLMs can help streamline things, like summarizing those really long nursing notes. What are some other specific jobs that researchers are looking at for LLMs?
Well, one area that's really cool is using LLMs to actually process physiological signals.
Okay.
So that's all about using data from sensors that are monitoring the body, heart rate, blood pressure, brain waves, all that, trying to find insights into people's health.
So it's like using AI to decode what our bodies are saying.
Yeah. Exactly. And there are researchers like Christensen, Geary, Locke, and their team. They've been exploring how these foundation models, a type of LLM, can be used for what's called precision medicine.
Oh yeah, I've heard that term a lot. How does that tie into physiological signals?
So the whole idea behind precision medicine is to really personalize those treatments based on someone's genes, their lifestyle, environment, all of it. And physiological signals, well, they can give you so much data to help understand how someone's body is responding to different treatments.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, you're using that data to figure out something more targeted.
Exactly. And LLMs can help us make sense of all that data.
Okay.
They can detect abnormalities, predict future health problems, even personalize those treatment plans based on a patient's specific physiological profile.
That's amazing. I mean, it sounds incredibly powerful, but I'm guessing there's some challenges too, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, for one thing, physiological signals can be really messy. It's not always easy to tell what's a meaningful pattern and what's just random noise.
So how are they dealing with that?
Well, one approach is to develop these specialized LLMs, ones that are specifically trained to process physiological signals.
Okay.
So they feed them massive data sets of physiological data, letting those models learn the subtle patterns that maybe humans would miss.
So it's like training, like a detective, to find those tiny clues.
Yeah, exactly. And the early results are pretty exciting. LLMs are already being used to detect heart arrhythmias, predict seizures in people with epilepsy, and even identify the early signs of sepsis.
Oh, wow. So you're saying that we could potentially use AI to catch those serious health problems, before they even become noticeable to us.
Yeah, it's a really cool area of research, and we're just getting started, I think.
This is amazing. All this talk about LLMs analyzing data makes me wonder, are they just analyzing stuff that's already out there? Or can they help us create new knowledge?
That is a great question. And it brings us to another really fascinating application of LLMs, automating those complex research tasks. One area where we're seeing a lot of progress is in single-cell genomics.
Single-cell genomics.
Yeah.
Can you give me a quick rundown on what that even is and how LLMs are being used?
Sure. So single-cell genomics, it's this revolutionary technology that lets scientists study individual cells within a tissue.
Okay.
It's like getting a super high-resolution picture of what's happening at the cellular level.
That sounds really, really detailed. What kind of information can you even get from studying individual cells like that?
Oh, tons. You can figure out all the different types of cells in a tissue, how they interact, even how they change over time. This is huge for understanding how tissues actually work and how diseases develop.
It sounds like it has massive implications for all kinds of medical research.
Absolutely. So where LLMs come in is in something called cell type annotation, which is basically the process of figuring out what type of cell each individual cell is. Is it a neuron, a muscle cell, an immune cell? And traditionally, this has been a really manual process.
So they had to analyze each cell one by one?
Yeah, it was super time consuming. But LLMs have the potential to automate that whole thing, making it way faster and less reliant on people, doing everything by hand.
That would save so much time. So how are they using the LLMs to do this?
So researchers like Liu, Xu, Zhang, and Zhang, they developed a benchmark called SOR, specifically to test how well LLMs do with cell type annotation. They train these LLMs on huge amounts of single-cell data, basically teaching them to recognize the molecular signatures of different cell types.
So the LLM learns to identify cells based on their molecular fingerprints.
That's a great way to put it. And the early results are pretty impressive. LLMs are already really good at annotating cell types, even in tissues that have tons of different cell populations.
This is incredible. It sounds like LLMs are creating whole new paths for scientific discoveries.
They really are. And the applications go way beyond just single-cell genomics. Researchers are trying to figure out how to use LLMs to automate all kinds of research tasks, designing new drug molecules, predicting how infectious diseases will spread. It's really amazing.
So much of what we've been talking about focuses on tasks that usually require, human experts. Are there any researchers looking at how LLMs might change how doctors and patients interact?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. And that's definitely one area where LLMs could make a big difference. One of the most promising things being looked at is using them to create summaries of those patient-doctor conversations.
That sounds really helpful.
Yeah,
Doctors spend so much time on all that documentation.
exactly. And there's some research that gets right into that. Nupani, Tripathi, Mitra, and their team created something called CLINICSUM, and it's specifically designed to do just that. It's a two-part system. First, it filters the conversation to pull out the important stuff, like the patient's symptoms, medical history, the doctor's assessment and plan. Then, the second part, it uses a language model to actually create the summary from that.
So it's kind of like having like a super efficient medical scribe, just listening in and taking notes.
Pretty much. And their research shows that ClinicSum actually works better than other language models when it comes to making these summaries.
That's really interesting. It sounds like LLMs could really help doctors have more time for patient care and less time, on paperwork.
Exactly. And it's not just about saving time. These summaries could actually help doctors and patients communicate better. Like, imagine a patient going home with a clear summary of what happened in their visit. It could really help them remember what was discussed.
That's a really good point. It seems like we're only just starting to figure out what LLMs can do in healthcare.
We really are. And what's so cool is that we're seeing progress everywhere. Like, from getting more accurate diagnoses to automating research to making patient-doctor communication better. It's pretty exciting.
It is exciting. It feels like we're on the edge of a major change in healthcare.
I think so too. But like with any big change, we got to think about some important things. Like, we've talked about evaluation and best practices, but there's also the bigger question of how this will impact society as a whole.
That's a really important point. What kind of questions are we talking about?
Well, for one, how do we make sure that these benefits reach everyone, not just the people who can afford them? How do we prevent LLMs from making those existing health disparities even worse?
Those are huge questions.
Yeah, no easy answers, but they're things we have to think about as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to make sure we're using these technologies to help everyone.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us to another critical part of this LLM research, evaluating their performance and figuring out the best ways to use them in healthcare.
Okay, let's get into that. How are researchers making sure that these LLMs are actually ready to deal with sensitive healthcare data and, make these big medical decisions?
So, as we talked about before, this is a fast-moving field, and those standardized ways of evaluating them are still being developed.
Yeah.
But researchers are making progress.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges they're running into?
One of the big ones is that the traditional ways of measuring performance, like accuracy, they don't always tell the whole story when it comes to LLMs in healthcare.
Okay.
For example, an LLM might be able to diagnose a disease based on a bunch of symptoms,
Okay.
but that doesn't necessarily mean it understands what's happening in the body or that it can explain its reasoning to a doctor.
Right. So it might be able to pass a test, but not actually practice medicine.
Exactly. And that's why they're trying to come up with new ways to evaluate them that go beyond just getting the right answer.
Okay. So what are they doing?
Well, one thing they're trying is to have human experts judge how well the LLMs are doing. For instance, Nupani, Tripathi, Mitra, and their colleagues, in their study on summaries, they actually had experts look at the summaries made by their ClinicSum framework and compare them to the ones written by doctors.
Oh, so it's like getting a second opinion to see if the LLM's on track.
Yeah, pretty much. And their research showed that ClinicSum actually did really well. Experts really liked it, which suggests it can make summaries that are both accurate and useful for doctors.
That's great. What other methods are they using?
Another thing they're doing is focusing on specific skills that are super important in healthcare, like, dealing with uncertainty, adapting to new information, explaining how they got to a decision.
So it's not just about getting the answer, it's about showing that they can think like a healthcare professional.
Exactly. And they're building these new benchmarks and ways to measure these abilities specifically.
This is all so important. It's a good reminder that we can't just blindly trust these LLMs.
Yeah.
We've got to really put them through their paces and make sure they're ready for the complexity of healthcare.
Absolutely. And besides just measuring how well they perform, we also need to establish best practices for how to actually use them in healthcare.
Okay, yeah. What are some of the key things to think about there?
Well, Bluthgen, Van Veen, Zaka, and their colleagues, in their review on best practices for LLMs in radiology, they highlight a bunch of important points, like understanding the limitations of LLMs, using good prompting strategies, and doing the right kind of fine-tuning.
Okay, break that down for me. What do they mean by understanding the limitations?
Well, it's important to remember that LLMs aren't magic.
Right.
They're powerful, but they have their weaknesses. They can be biased, they can hallucinate, they can struggle with things that require common sense or understanding the context of a situation.
So we got to be realistic about what they can and can't do.
Exactly, and that's where prompting strategies come in. We touched on this earlier, but it's important. The way you talk to an LLM, the prompts you give it, the questions you ask, all of that can have a huge impact on what it does.
So it's like the difference between asking a human expert a vague question versus a very specific one.
Exactly. If you craft your prompts carefully, you can really guide the LLM's thinking process.
Okay, that makes sense. What about fine-tuning? We keep hearing that term. What does that actually mean?
So fine-tuning is basically taking an LLM that's already been trained on a massive data set and then tweaking it for a specific job or area.
So it's like taking a general LLM and making it like an expert in radiology or cardiology or something.
Exactly. And fine-tuning can really improve how well it does on tasks in that specific area.
This is all so important. It sounds like we need a whole new skill set to use these things effectively in healthcare.
You're absolutely right. And research like the work by Mahmoud, Jan, Reyes, and their team on evaluating radiology reports, that's super valuable.
What did they find?
They came up with this new way to check the quality of radiology reports made by LLMs. It's called fine-grained phrasal grounding.
Remind me, what's that again?
So basically, it links the phrases in the report to specific spots in the medical images. So if the LLM says something like, there's a mass in the upper left lobe of the lung, you can actually see if that's what the image shows.
Ah, so you're fact-checking the report against what you actually see.
Exactly. This kind of detailed evaluation is crucial because we need to make sure those LLMs are making reports that are accurate and match the medical findings.
This deep dive is really showing how complex it is to work with LLMs in healthcare. It's not just about throwing AI at a problem and hoping for the best. It takes a lot of planning, testing, and refining.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have experts like Rishabh Ghul, who's looking at using text embedding models and vector databases to organize and classify medical text data.
Okay, hold on. We need to break that down a bit. Text embedding models. Vector databases. What are those?
Okay, so imagine you want to search for a medical document, but you want to search based on meaning, not just keywords.
Okay.
That's where text embedding models come in. They turn words and sentences into these lists of numbers called vectors that capture their meaning. So similar concepts have similar vectors, even if they use different words.
So instead of searching for heart attack, you could search for a vector that represents the idea of a heart attack and find stuff that talks about the same thing but uses different words.
Exactly. And these vectors are kept in something called a vector database, which is made specifically for finding information based on these meaning vectors.
That's really clever. It's like a much smarter way to search for medical info than just keywords.
Exactly. And Goal's research shows that this can be really good for classifying medical text data. He found that using more detailed embeddings, basically longer lists of numbers, worked better, but simpler searches in the database were best for performance.
So it's about finding the right balance.
Right. And this kind of research is really important for figuring out how to search and analyze all this medical data that we have.
Wow, we really went deep on this one. From diagnosing those rare diseases to summarizing patient conversations, it seems like LLMs are popping up everywhere in healthcare these days.
It's a fast-moving field, that's for sure. And it's not just theoretical. I mean, they're really trying to solve real-world problems, which is exciting.
That is what makes it so fascinating. Remember at the beginning we were asking, is it all hype or hope when it comes to LLMs in healthcare? So where do you stand now?
I'd say, honestly, a bit of both. The hype is there for a reason. I mean, the potential, it's huge, but we can't ignore those limitations, right? LLMs aren't some magic cure-all. And we've seen, with hallucinations and bias, there are things we really have to watch out for.
It's like we're at this really interesting point where we have this amazing technology, so much promise, but we've got to be smart about how we use it. So for you, what's the most important thing we learned from all this research?
For me, it's just how many different ways they can be used. We saw LLMs analyzing medical images, summarizing research papers, even helping doctors communicate better. That's a pretty amazing range.
It really is. It feels like they could change everything about healthcare, from the lab to the doctor's office. It's exciting, but like you said, we have to be careful. What are some of those big questions we should be thinking about as we move forward with this technology?
I think one of the most urgent ones is, how do we make sure that everyone benefits, not just, a select few? We have to be really aware of those potential biases in the data and make sure that they don't end up creating unfair outcomes.
Absolutely. We don't want AI making existing inequalities in healthcare worse. We talked about the importance of evaluating these models and figuring out the best practices.
Yeah.
What are the researchers focusing on in that area?
Well, one thing they're really working on is coming up with ways to measure performance that go beyond just accuracy. It's not enough for an LLM to just get the answer right. We need to know how it got there, if its logic is sound, if it can explain its reasoning to a human.
So we're holding these LLMs to the same standards we would hold a doctor.
Exactly. We need to be able to trust these systems. And that trust comes from, really testing them rigorously and making sure everything is transparent.
I've learned so much from this deep dive. It's clear that this whole world of LLMs in healthcare, it's complicated, it's constantly changing. If our listeners could only take away one thing from this conversation, what would you want it to be?
I'd want them to understand both the potential and the challenges of using LLMs in healthcare. I mean, these are powerful tools, right? They could really revolutionize how we deal with disease. But it's on all of us, researchers, doctors, policymakers, patients. We all have to make sure they're used responsibly and ethically.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. This has been a fascinating journey. So to all our listeners out there, what really caught your attention during this deep dive? What are your thoughts on all of this, the potential, the risks, all of it? Let us know. You can share your thoughts with us on social media, send us an email. We want to keep this conversation going.
This is only the beginning, It's going to be a really exciting and maybe even transformative time for healthcare.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those gov questions, and keep diving deep.